Chapter 11. The Early Reservation Years, 1880 to 1920. The Big Picture. After the bison were destroyed, Montana's Indians went through a period of tremendous change. These were years of great hardship for Indian people as they learned to live in a new way. Their strength and adaptability helped them survive and pass on their cultural traditions. In the late 1800s, Montana's Indians entered a period of a tremendous upheaval. The bison, once the center of life here, teetered on the brink of extinction. The expanding United States had overwhelmed the tribe's economic and military power and confined the native people to reservations.
Land that tribes reserved for their own use through treaties.
When the Indian tribes were strong, the U.S. government respected their sovereignty.
Powers of self-government.
But when they became weak, the government took more control. Government policies imposed many difficulties on the Indian people as they adapted to a new way of life. The story of this period is one of great suffering, but also of great perseverance.
Strength and endurance.
The bison era comes to an end. In 1881, Sitting Bull, who had helped lead the Sioux during the Battle of the Little Bighorn, returned from Canada, where he and his band had fled at the end of the Great Sioux War. Returning to the United States meant surrendering to the U.S. Army. Sitting Bull did not want to give up his freedom, but his people were starving. The buffalo were gone. Even smaller game animals were hard to find. On the day of his surrender, he gave his 8-year-old son, Crowfoot, his gun to turn over to the commanding officer. Then he said, "The boy has given it to you, and now he wants to know how he is going to make a living." The question of how to make a living haunted all of Montana's Indians in the early reservation era. Starvation winter, trading more land for food. For most of the 1870s, Montana's tribes continued to live primarily on the game and plants they harvested, just as their ancestors had for generations. They depended very little on annuities, which are annual payments of food, equipment, supplies, and funds the U.S. government owned a tribe by treaty. But by 1880, the bison were nearly gone. The population of settlers had boomed, and there was little game to hunt. The Blackfeet, Gros Ventres, Sioux, and Assiniboine, who lived on a large reservation covering much of northern Montana, increasingly depended on the government annuities for survival. These annuities were not charity, they were payments for land.
See Chapter 7.
Yet despite its treaty agreements, Congress reduced the amount of money it was willing to spend on annuities. For several years, there was not enough food to get people through the winter. In 1883, winter storms came early. The few provisions that the government did send to the northern tribes were held up by early snows. Finally, in December, a wagon load of bacon arrived at Browning, so old it was contaminated with maggots. Approximately 1/4 of the Blackfeet tribe, 600 people, died from starvation. The Assiniboine lost approximately 300 people. Many Gros Ventres and Sioux also died from hunger and exposure. Tribal people call this period Starvation Winter. After Starvation Winter, the tribes sold the only resource they had left, land. The Sweetgrass Hills Agreement of 1888 reduced the large northern Indian reserve to 3 smaller reservations, the Blackfeet, Fort Belknap, and Fort Peck reservations. In 1895, the Blackfeet sold another strip of land that prospectors hoped would contain gold. When no gold was found there, most of this land became Glacier National Park. The next year, the government pressured the Assiniboine and Gros Ventres to sell a 28-square-mile chunk of the sacred Little Rocky Mountains. There, miners developed a large gold mine. Life on the reservations. By 1888, 9 Indian tribes, the Blackfeet, Crow, Assiniboine, Gros Ventres, Sioux, Salish, Kootenai, Pend d'Oreille, and Northern Cheyenne, were living on 6 Montana reservations. Rocky Boys Reservation, home to members of the Chippewa and Cree tribes, was not established until 1916.
See Chapter 15.
Government policies on the reservations reflected what many non-Indians thought at the time, that the best way for Indians to adjust to a rapidly changing world was to give up their tribal traditions and live like Euro-Americans.
Americans with European influence or ancestry.
Assimilation, when one culture is absorbed into another majority culture, was the goal of the reservations. So while American Indian tribes struggled to maintain their cultural traditions in the face of change, the government's goal was to tear apart tribal traditions and replace them with Euro-American practices. Secretary of the Interior Columbus Delando made this goal clear in 1872. Quote, "It is our duty to coerce the Indians into the adoption and practice of our habits and customs." Agents controlled the reservations. Each reservation had an agent, appointed by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. The reservation agent managed the tribe's limited budget and controlled how the money was spent. He also set the rules for the reservation, and he could arrest people or withhold food rations if they broke those rules. The tribes owned the land, yet agents had almost complete control over life on the reservation. Some agents worked hard to help the Indians on their reservations. Peter Ronan, a longtime agent on the Flathead Reservation, for example, tried to keep the railroad from cutting timber on the reservation and to keep white farmers from taking Indian land. However, most agents did not know very much about the Indian people they were supposed to be helping. Many agents came from far away and stayed for only a short time. Often they did not have enough knowledge, money, or supplies to do the job. And some were simply dishonest. They stole money from the tribes, sold tribal food for their own profit, or used tribal resources for their own gain. On the more established reservations, like the Flathead Reservation, people had developed farms, ranches, and sawmills over several decades. Their economic independence gave them power to resist some government control. But on the poorest reservations, people depended on government annuities. The government agents could often control people by withholding food and supplies. Forcing a new way. Even honest agents thought they were helping Indians by forcing them to abandon their traditional cultures and to adopt mainstream
majority
American culture. Agents pressured tribal members to change their social customs, dress in European-style clothing, live in rectangular houses, become Christian, send their children to school, and learn farming and ranching the Euro-American way. Agents often outlawed Indian religious ceremonies like the sun dance. They discouraged giveaway ceremonies, a traditional practice of honoring the Creator by giving away food, blankets, horses, and other forms of wealth. If people performed their traditional practices or religious rituals, they could lose their food rations or be arrested. They also were not allowed to leave their reservations without a pass. The reservation system tore apart tribal leadership. Each tribe had long-established traditions for earning leadership roles. But reservation life made it difficult for young men to become leaders in the traditional way, because they could not count coup, earn respect by performing acts of bravery during a battle, host a sun dance, or complete other traditional requirements for leadership. Reservation agents sometimes selected their own chiefs, and refused to deal with strong Indian leaders who disagreed with them. By removing the Indians' traditional leadership, the government made it harder for people to make decisions. Tribal members knew they needed to make changes to survive, but they did not always agree on how fast things should change and in what ways. These disagreements sometimes caused serious conflict within the tribes. For example, on the Blackfeet Reservation, one group pushed for economic development projects, like oil development and irrigation, even though older, more traditional Blackfeet would not benefit. Another group wanted to slow down development to make sure tribal decisions were made according to traditional values. These arguments split the Blackfeet tribe. Some of these disagreements continue today. The people kept their cultures alive. Montana's Indians knew they needed to learn new skills and find new ways to support themselves, but they refused to abandon their tribal identities and cultural traditions to survive. They performed giveaways and held religious ceremonies in secret. They turned patriotic and religious holidays, like the 4th of July and Easter, into celebrations of their own traditions. In 1898, the tribes of the Flathead Reservation held their first 4th of July powwow,
an American Indian celebration.
They staged parades, held contests, sang and drummed together, and danced traditional dances like the war dance and the snake dance deep into the night. Indians on other reservations also held celebrations on July 4th. The organizers assured the reservation agent that these gatherings were purely social, but they actually performed important religious and tribal ceremonies. Federal agents also started county fairs on reservations to show off Indians' farming accomplishments. In 1904, for example, the Crow Reservation agent started the Crow Fair. At the fair, the Crows staged parades, horse races, and rodeos. They used the fair to reinforce tribal values and traditions. Today, Crow Fair is one of the most popular summer events in Montana. Diseases set everyone back. While each reservation was different, they all struggled against poverty and disease. Sudden changes in how American Indians lived and what they ate made them especially vulnerable to illness. Poor sanitation, crowded living conditions, and lack of nutritious food helped spread contagious diseases. Tuberculosis, an infectious lung disease, was the leading killer of American Indians in the early reservation years. Tuberculosis sickened 1/3 of the entire American Indian population, and up to 90% on some reservations. Trachoma, a contagious eye disease that causes blindness, affected 1 in every 5 American Indians. Thousands of non-Indians suffered and died from these diseases too, but they were most prevalent on Indian reservations. Making a living on the reservations. Indian people learned Euro-American farming techniques as a way to make a living after the bison were gone. The Salish, Pend d'Oreille, and Kootenai people of western Montana had been growing vegetables and wheat since the 1850s. Their hard work, their hand-dug irrigation system, and the rich, loamy soils of the region helped the people of the Flathead Reservation make headway against the grinding poverty that reservation life usually brought. The Northern Cheyenne people had begun farming and timber cutting in the 1880s, even before they had a reservation. The Crow people, too, gained some success in farming. Far back in Crow history, before the Crow people came to the plains, they had been agriculturalists. Perhaps this helped them become successful farmers during this period. Some reservation farmers struggled to build farms and learn how to operate unfamiliar equipment. Often, the government did not send adequate equipment and funding, as promised in the treaties. On the Flathead Reservation, there were not enough plows to work the 80 fields of wheat. Reservation agent John Mullen reported that one old Salish man planted a considerable crop this year, literally scratching it in with his nails. Water and the winter's decision. While Indians were building their farms, their non-Indian neighbors were also building farms and ranches. Non-Indians often grazed their cattle on reservation lands and diverted water from rivers and streams to irrigate their farms. On the Fort Belknap Reservation, an argument over water turned into a landmark
historically important
court decision establishing water rights for Indian tribes. In 1905, the Fort Belknap Reservation agent, William R. Logan, complained to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that nearby farmers were diverting water from the Milk River before it could flow through the reservation. "So far this spring we have had no water in our ditch whatever," he wrote. "All will be lost unless some radical action is taken. To the Indians, it means either good crops this fall or starvation this winter." The argument over water rights went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court's ruling became known as the Winters Decision, named after one of the people involved in the case. The Winters Decision upheld the Indians' rights to the water based on treaty agreements. This victory gave Indian tribes all over the United States a vital tool in their struggle to survive and to remain on their land. Ranching on the reservations. Many tribal members embraced ranching. Cattle ranching and horse raising allowed them to support their families while practicing time-honored cultural values, like feeding relatives and giving away cattle and horses. Reservation ranchers formed cattlemen's associations based on family groups and clans, which helped strengthen traditional social structures. Ranching on the reservation sometimes conflicted with traditional tribal values. Reservation agents pressured ranchers to work for profit, save money, buy more equipment, and become more successful. But tribal tradition encouraged everyone to work for the good of the tribe and help anyone in need. On the Blackfeet Reservation, some ranchers sold off their cattle during hard winters to help feed hungry relatives. But when they did not show a profit, the reservation agent labeled them incompetent and did not allow them any more opportunities. Each tribe and family struggled to find a balance between tribal traditions and new definitions of success. The government kills off Crow and Cheyenne herds. Indian agents were supposed to encourage Indian ranchers to work for their own gain. But in 1914, the agent on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation took 20,000 to 30,000 cattle owned by individual Northern Cheyenne ranchers. These ranchers had established a reputation for high-quality cattle. When the agent took their cattle, they lost everything they had worked for. Agency
Reservation headquarters.
Officials began managing the herd for reservation use, but they failed to provide winter feed and left the cattle on the summer grounds through midwinter. Within a few years, there were only 4,000 cattle left. The reservation sold them off, and the government opened the reservation to grazing for white cattlemen. The Northern Cheyenne people once again plunged into poverty. Dr. Richard Littlebear, a Northern Cheyenne educator and college president, said his grandfather had been a relatively successful rancher before 1914. He owned livestock, had built a house, and was providing well for his family, Littlebear said. After the government took his livestock away, all incentives seemed to desert him. This happened to many Northern Cheyenne families. The pressure by non-Indians to spread onto reservation lands continued. In 1919, the government ordered the Crow and Northern Cheyenne tribes to reduce the number of horses on the reservation. The horses ate grass that white ranchers wanted for their cattle. These ranchers paid the agents for grazing rights on the reservations. The government wanted these horses killed because the herds did not have economic value. The tribes refused. As historian Joe Medicine Crow wrote, it was like ordering a man to kill his best friend or brother. In 1923, the government contracted with non-Indian cattlemen to shoot thousands of horses on the Crow and Northern Cheyenne reservations. One large outfit had to import Texas gunmen to do the shooting, as local cowboys were soon disgusted with the slaughter, wrote Medicine Crow. Other reservation industries. The Flathead, Crow, and Northern Cheyenne reservations all had timber abundant enough to support commercial sawmills. At first, government employees, not tribal members, ran the mills and used the lumber. Indian people did not get to cut and sell timber. After 1900, the Indian tribes regained some control over their forest lands. Forestry and lumber milling became an important part of the tribal economy on the Flathead, Crow, and Northern Cheyenne reservations. Each tribe worked to develop the resources it had. For example, the Blackfeet tribe tried to gain some economic benefit from oil. The tribe itself lacked the funds to invest in oil equipment and the expertise to drill for oil. Instead, it leased its oil resources to non-Indian developers. But the federal government discouraged oil leases on the reservations and sometimes failed to enforce the terms of the leases they had agreed to. So the tribe received only a few $1,000s from several small oil leases during the 1920s. The Dawes Act. Allotments subdivide the reservations. One purpose of the reservations was to turn Indians into farmers. This was part of Thomas Jefferson's view of America as a nation of small farmers who owned their own land.
See Chapter 4.
In the 1880s, concerned non-Indians worried that American Indians were not becoming farmers fast enough. Some wanted to help Indians expand their economies and attract businesses onto their reservations. At the same time, Montana ranchers and farmers continually pressured the government to open up more reservation land for farms and cattle grazing. As a result of these various pressures, Congress passed the Dawes Act of 1887, also called the General Allotment Act. The act was named after its sponsor, U.S. Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts. The Dawes Act is one of the most important and controversial laws in American Indian history. Its effects are still felt today.
See Chapter 22.
The Dawes Act had several goals: to break up tribes as economic units, to encourage individual incentive, to reduce the government's costs of running the reservations, and to provide more land to white settlers. Supporters thought the Dawes Act would help destroy tribes, which they saw as obstacles to assimilation. The Dawes Act provided for reservations to be allotted, divided up, into individual parcels about the size of a small family farm. Heads of households were typically assigned 160 acres. Unmarried tribal members over age 18 usually received 80 acres. Married women could not receive allotments until after 1891. Once land was allotted, it was owned by an individual, not by the tribe. Allotted lands were held in trust when something is owned by one person but managed by another, in this case the government, for 25 years. After that, they could be sold. The land that was not allotted to Indian individuals or families could be declared surplus.
Extra.
Often, these surplus lands were sold to white settlers, businesses, and homesteaders at discount prices. The Dawes Act affected each reservation differently. Allotments came to the Crow Reservation first, starting in 1888. But it took many years to complete the process, and before it was finished, Crow leaders fought for, and won, the right to determine how the process would work. After allotments were completed in the early 1920s, most of the land remained in the hands of tribal members. Determined and skillful Crow negotiators kept land from being sold to non-Indians as surplus land. Allotments began on the Blackfeet Reservation in 1907. The government designated 156,000 acres as surplus. The Blackfeet tribe was $1 million in debt after following federal instructions to build a large irrigation system. To pay off this debt, the government wanted to sell off the surplus land as quickly as possible. But the Blackfeet protested the land sale. An educated Blackfeet spokesman named Robert Hamilton testified repeatedly before congressional committees and with the Federal Office of Indian Affairs. Finally, in 1919, Congress accepted a compromise. Surplus Blackfeet land was added to individual allotments and remained in Blackfeet hands. The Fort Peck Reservation was allotted between 1908 and 1913. This was the height of the homestead boom.
See Chapter 13.
Each adult male received 320 acres plus a few acres of farm and timber lands. After allotments were completed, the government declared 1.3 million acres surplus and open to homesteaders. Today, most of the best agricultural land on the Fort Peck Reservation is owned by non-Indians. Allotments came to the Flathead Reservation in 1908, despite strong protests from the tribes who lived there. After allotments, the government intended to declare the rest of the reservation surplus and open to it for sale. Salish Chief Charlo, who had defended his people's right to remain in the Bitterroot Valley in the 1880s, protested any further loss of tribal lands. He already had told the government in 1901, "I won't sell a foot." The government delayed until Chief Charlo died in 1910. 2 weeks after Charlo's death, the government announced that it would open 1 million acres of the reservation for sale to homesteaders. More than 2/3 of the Flathead Reservation lands, including most of the fertile Mission Valley, transferred out of tribal hands.
See the maps in Chapter 13.
On the Fort Belknap Reservation, tribal leaders saw allotments as a way to preserve the land they had left. Large tracts of their reservation lands had been illegally sold off. They had also lost a large chunk of the Little Rockies when the government forced the tribes to sell it for a gold mining operation in 1896. Profits from these land sales never made it into tribal hands. Scared that the government would take even more of their land, the Fort Belknap tribes lobbied to have the reservation allotted. They successfully insisted that all the land go to tribal members. Their reservation was allotted in 1923. The Northern Cheyennes also fought to preserve their reservation lands. They were able to postpone allotments until 1932 to 1934, and the tribe managed to retain ownership of most of its land. The results of allotment. Think about what it would be like if someone came into your home, confined you to the room you happened to be standing in, and sold the rest of the house because you were not using it. For many Indian people, this is what allotment was like. Together, Montana's reservations lost more than 400,000 acres of land, in some cases the only farmable land on the reservation, to non-Indian ownership. Before allotments, tribal members on the Flathead Reservation were about as well off as non-Indian farmers, but losing access to farmland, grazing land, and other important resources drove many of them into poverty. On the Blackfeet, Crow, and Flathead reservations, the government had urged tribes to spend large amounts of money to build irrigation projects. But those irrigation projects ended up mostly helping the non-Indian farmers who moved onto the reservations, not the Indians who paid for the improvements. Allotments also changed how land was used on reservations. It forced some tribal members to sell off large horse and cattle herds that could no longer graze on communal,
shared by all members of a community,
reservation lands. Where it was too dry to farm, Indian landowners often sold their allotments just to pay for their taxes or buy food. The Blackfeet, for example, lost 200,000 acres between 1912 and 1929. Most of the land went to local businesses to pay debts for items purchased at their stores. In the 47 years that allotments were in effect, tribes across the West lost 70% of their remaining lands. Years later, John Collier, the U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs, wrote that allotments had caused poverty bordering on starvation in many areas, a 30% illiteracy rate,
percentage of people who cannot read,
a death rate twice that of the white population, and the loss of more than 90 million acres of Indian land. Losing ourselves, the boarding school experience. Imagine being rounded up by foreigners, taken from your parents, and sent to a strange institution far away from home. Your clothes are burned. Your hair is cut off, something that usually happens when a family member dies. You are punished for speaking your own language. You are given a new unfamiliar name and made to answer to it. People you do not know force you to eat, sleep, talk, and work in a way that is strange to you. No matter how homesick you get, you may not see your parents again for many years. Many Americans thought that the fastest way to help Indian people assimilate,
be absorbed into the majority culture,
was to remove Indian children from their families and bring them up as white children. So thousands of Indian children were sent to boarding schools. Reservation agents forced parents to surrender their children so they could be sent to schools. Sometimes families lost their food rations for not cooperating. Most of Montana's Indians favored education. They wanted their children to learn new skills and professions, but they did not want their children taken away from them, and they did not want their children to lose respect for tribal traditions. Many children went to boarding schools on the reservations. Often their parents would camp near the schools hoping to see their children. Some educators believed that students would assimilate faster if they were removed from the reservations entirely. After 1890, several thousands of Montana's Indian children were sent far away, to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the Haskell Indian School in Kansas, or the Chippewa Indian School in Oregon. Most of these students did not return home for many years. The goal of the schools was to erase the children's memories of their native language and culture, and to reshape them as non-Indians. Students studied half the day and worked the other half in laundries, kitchens, leather shops, and dairies. They learned English, math, and how to structure their day by the clock. A retired military officer oversaw the Carlisle School, which he ran like a military unit. Students wore uniforms, marched in military formation, and submitted to disciplines like beatings and imprisonment in solitary cells. Many of the schools were overcrowded, which meant that diseases like tuberculosis spread quickly. Some playgrounds were dotted with gravestones of the children who died at school. Many children tried to run away, especially from boarding schools that were on the reservations. Tribal police were paid to bring them back. Reservation schools usually allowed parents to see their children for short vacations, but students at the faraway schools were sent to white families to work during school vacations. Educated Indians helped their tribes. Even though boarding schools caused much pain and heartache, they also taught Indian children new skills. educated Indians returned home with job skills and knowledge that helped them improve life on their reservations. Crow Chief Plenty Coups knew how important it was for the tribe to have young, educated Indians who knew how to speak, write, and negotiate with white lawyers and politicians. As young educated men returned from off-reservation boarding schools, he put them to work making sure the government fulfilled its treaty obligations. Some, like Robert Yellowtail, negotiated with Congress and became activist leaders. One powerful example happened in 1898. A government delegation pressured the Crow tribe to give up more land for railroads and homesteads. Plenty Coups told the delegation that the government already was behind on payments already promised. "When you have made these settlements to the Indians, then you can come back, and I and my people will talk to you about these lands you now want," he said. Then Plenty Coups introduced a group of young men just back from government schools. One of them, Carl Leiter, stepped up and read an itemized list of the payments the government had promised and failed to make. Leiter stunned the commissioners. They left, promising to postpone discussions until payments could be made. Blackfeet leader Robert Hamilton stood up for the rights of traditional full-blood Blackfeet people against a group of mixed-blood Blackfeet businessmen who wanted to control most of the tribe's resources. The government listened to the businessmen because they supported economic development programs. But Hamilton spoke for the traditional families who lived in desperate poverty because of federal programs. Hamilton had graduated from Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and his knowledge and eloquence,
ability to speak convincingly,
made Congress listen. His leadership kept the tribe from losing power, money, and much of its land base. The boarding school era lasted from 1880 to 1934. During that time, family ties broke apart. Several generations of Indian children grew up far from the love and guidance of parents, family, and community. When they had children of their own, they had no role models for parenthood. Many American Indian families still struggle with the after effects of the boarding school era. Yet many children found ways to survive and maintain their cultural identity. They forged intertribal, which means between tribes, friendships that later empowered American Indians to work together for political and cultural changes. Many returned home to help their tribes. Their creativity and resilience,
ability to withstand great stress,
helped them to use what they learned about mainstream American law and politics to begin making changes. People of strength and power endure. The native people of the northern Rocky Mountains had endured a century of transformation. Throughout the 1800s, they saw new populations sweep across their lands. They suffered terribly from disease, and they lost the bison, the primary resource upon which their cultures depended. At the end of the 1800s, many non-Indians assumed that Indian tribes would soon disappear. Disease, loss of land, and attempts to destroy American Indian cultures did much damage. Nevertheless, Montana's Indian people managed to adapt. Not only did they survive, but they also preserved important aspects of their cultures. Today, the number of tribal members is growing. As Blackfeet Tribal Council Chairman Earl Old Person put it, "Our ability to adapt to the environment and to change is infinite and assures our survival. The struggles Indian people went through to survive have made us stronger, and it is through this experience that we can conquer the obstacles ahead."
Expressions of the people. Star quilts. In the late 1800s, some churchwomen in the Dakotas began teaching quilting to Sioux women on their reservations. The Sioux women particularly liked one quilt pattern called the star quilt. They associated the star quilt pattern with the sacred circle and the morning star, two powerful images in Northern Plains cultures. The Sioux adapted the craft of quilt making to their own traditions. They began developing their own star quilt designs using what scraps of fabric were available. They cut templates, patterns, for their quilt pieces out of tin or wood and later cardboard or plastic oatmeal lids. They stitched important cultural symbols into their patterns, and they passed on their skills and knowledge to the younger women. Star quilting quickly spread across the Fort Peck Reservation. Each quilter learned the craft from her teacher, usually an aunt, grandmother, or close friend. but she had to develop her own creative ideas for pattern, color, and use of images or decorative items. A star quilter occasionally sold her work, but most quilts were made to give away. Women made quilts for marriages, births, and coming-of-age ceremonies. They gave them to soldiers leaving for war and to young men embarking on spiritual quests. And when a person died, a star quilt might drape the coffin, wrap the body, or hang on the wall during the funeral. Over the years, the star quilt has become a vital part of Northern Plains Indian culture. Because of their beauty and difficulty, star quilts became the center of giveaway ceremonies. Each quilt represents many days of detailed work. The Sioux and Assiniboine gain honor by giving away something of such value and traditional importance. Star quilts blend contemporary artistry with ancient traditions. By adopting a Euro-American art form and making it their own, star quilters have enriched Sioux and Assiniboine culture with creativity and vigor.